Die groot oomblik is uiteindelik hier. Die skrywer en joernalis Karyn Maughan kuier vanoggend by ons om te gesels oor haar splinternuwe boek, Nuclear: Inside South Africa's Secret Deals. Good morning, Karyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Karyn, your book is, it's almost too much to mention in the 15 minutes that we have. Tell us, where did this start? Where did the idea for your book start? Why did you write it?
Well, myself and my co-author, Kirsten Pearson, who was a former employee of the National Treasury's GTAC unit, knew that we needed to somehow document or begin documenting how Treasury had resisted or tried to deal with the attempted, the vast array of attempted acts of state capture that the South African public is still attempting to recover from. And we kept coming back to nuclear, the nuclear deal with Russia, which in many respects, I would argue, was the biggest attempted act of state capture by the Zuma administration and those aligned with the Gupta, project of essentially capturing state-owned entities and aspects of government so that they could enrich themselves from that corruption.
Karyn, had this deal gone through with Russia, what would some of the consequences have been?
Well, I think the pivotal thing to remember is that National Treasury's biggest issue was that they didn't know where we were going to get the money for this deal from. And what was happening was that the Zuma and his cohorts within the government were essentially pushing for a 1 trillion rand deal with Russia with no real sense of how they would finance it in circumstances where the Russian government was potentially putting forward a build, own, operate model of nuclear build, where they were saying, well, we would potentially finance this. And as a consequence, South Africa would have been in a situation not only where we were dealing with the implications of pouring all this money into this massive deal that we could not necessarily afford, but we would have been receiving, Russia would have been financing it, and the Russian state would have essentially owned those nuclear reactors. So if the project had gone ahead, South Africa would have been dependent on Russia for 23% of its energy from Russian nuclear reactors in circumstances we were paying the Russians back. So it wasn't just the debt aspect, the implications for electricity tariffs, what we would have been paying for electricity. It was also the geopolitical implications of us depending on Russia for a quarter of our energy in circumstances where we now see with our stance on the Ukraine how much of an influence our relationship with Russia is already having on our geopolitical positioning in the world.
Karyn, you're referring to the geopolitical situation. What was the potential result if this went ahead? What was the dangers in Africa as a whole? Was South Africa basically seen as a starting point?
Absolutely, and that comes out in 2014 when the original deal is signed between Tina Joemat-Pettersson, the energy minister, and Rosatom, the Russian nuclear agency. And Rosatom makes it very clear in those statements that they see South Africa as a potential springboard for a kind of, they don't use this word, but nuclear colonization project of Africa, that they would be building reactors in South Africa and going to different countries in Africa and building reactors in those countries. Now, the important thing to mention at this point is that there are real question marks as to whether Russia could have even afforded to fund a nuclear reactor project in South Africa. We know that they are trying to they were doing a similar project in Egypt. The deal was signed. But to this day, those reactors still haven't been built now because of the Ukraine crisis. So, there were these big dreams of a kind of nuclear colonization of Africa starting in South Africa. What would that have translated into? At its best for the Zuma administration, we would have depended on Russia for a quarter of our energy. We would have been this Russian partner for a big colonization of Africa through nuclear. At worst, we would have been sitting in a situation where we were dependent on them for a build that was probably unlikely not to happen. In circumstances, we would have then been a conduit for their kind of nuclear ambitions on the continent, with real question marks over the power that we had in that situation. And then as a last point, one of the pivotal issues with that nuclear deal with agreement with Russia was that in addition to giving Russia tax exemptions that no other country would have had in a kind of nuclear deal, it also indemnified Russia against any civil liability or of any kind if there was a nuclear accident in a Russian nuclear reactor plant in South Africa, which would, of course, have had massive implications if that had happened. We wouldn't have been able to seek any recourse against them whatsoever.
Karyn, I think my question is because you mentioned that Russia might not even have had the ability to actually deliver on this great proposal. And you also mentioned in the book that at a stage, Eskom speaks to companies from America, from France, and eventually we settle on Russia. What are the ties back then, 2014 and even before that? Why did we actually decide to go with Russia if we weren't even sure that they would have the capabilities?
Well, you know, there was this vehement belief from Zuma and his administration that indeed Russia did have the capabilities. Russia, as he told me, offered us the best deal, you know, in terms of a nuclear build project. But what we need to understand is that the nuclear project was very much built on the backs of us joining BRICS in 2010. In the book, we speak about the fact that around that period, massive Chinese delegation comes to Eskom and does this big nuclear presentation about, you know, a potential nuclear project in South Africa. So it very much appears that us joining BRICS was somehow linked to the promise that we would then pursue a nuclear build of some kind. Interestingly enough, the Gupta family purchased Shiva uranium mine in 2010. So this whole issue sort of starts emerging at that time. But then, you know, there's a successive attempts by various energy ministers to conclude some kind of deal with Russia. But it's in 2014, a few weeks after former President Zuma believes, and it's well documented, that he has been saved from a poisoning attempt by the CIA, by Russia, by my friend Vladimir Putin, that deal, that sort of unlawful deal that is set aside subsequently by the Western Cape High Court, is signed. So what we have is a situation where, you know, it is this geopolitical positioning, et cetera, but there's also this antagonism to the West that underpins that deal, and this belief that Zuma will carry forward as the deal progresses, that anyone who stands in the way, be it Treasury, Energy Department officials, aren't doing it because they have real and valid questions over the financing and the implications for South Africa. They're doing it because they're aligned to this murderous Western plot against him that is being pushed by alleged apartheid spies who he never names. And that kind of madness takes over in the deal, and I think was underpinning a lot of the bizarre things that then happened and the manifest illegality of what occurred.
This bizarre reaction, political madness, as you refer to it, quite rightly so. We're going to have to talk about that in the second segment, but I also want to talk about the fact that nuclear energy as a concept, or as applicable in South Africa, or as proper in South Africa or not, is not the subject of the book.
Not at all. And I mean, this is not a debate about whether nuclear energy is a potential right solution for South Africa. It's a debate about how do you do energy procurement in a way that is transparent, cost-effective, and meets the ambit of the Constitution, which sets very high standards for how we need to procure energy. And it cannot be that our energy solutions are built on the whims of one person who has a particular ambition and a particular relationship and a particular fervor for a particular country and its energy agency. We need to start making energy decisions that are practical, cost-effective, and work for the entire South African population in ways that aren't going to get us into worse debt than we already are. And if we look at what happened with Medupi and Kusile, what a disaster that has been, it is very clear that the South African state, as it currently stands, does not appear to have the ability to procure energy in a way that is not corrupt and not damaging to the South African public.
And you refer to the 1 trillion rand that it might have cost us to build a nuclear plant. And as you refer to now, quite rightly, with Medupi and Kusile, that would not have been the final amount. We expect that it would have been much more because it wouldn't have been finished on time and there would have been rebuilds.
Exactly, and that's what essentially happened with Medupi and Kusile. They are still not completed. And we know that, this current bout of load shedding is very much linked to breakdowns. We know that Eskom is now looking for R500 million to do repairs. That procurement was an absolute disaster. If you speak to someone like Chris Yellen, the energy experts in the sector, they will explain exactly why Modipo and Kusile was a completely problematic build for Eskom to take on. And it is the source of a lot, if not the majority, of Eskom's sovereign debt, which poses such a threat to our economy. So we have a model for why, how energy procurement has been done under this regime and how disastrous it had been. But if we think we're sitting in problems with Modipo and Kusile now, had there been a kind of nuclear reactor build with the kind of culture of corruption, irregularity, nepotism, jobs for friends, etc., and the kickback culture that has been manifestly made apparent by the Zondo Commission, it would have been a complete disaster for us because we simply cannot trust the state
Absolutely.
as it arguably now to do the right thing.
Yeah. Wow. Karyn, that's very interesting. I think in our next segment, we also want to speak about some of those heroes that actually stopped this from going forth. Thank you so much.
Welkom terug. Ons gesels vanmôre met Karyn Maughan, die skrywer van die boek Nuclear Inside South Africa's Secret Deal. And Karyn, Jennifer has referred to it earlier. There are heroes in the story. But in the first segment of our interview, we referred to the financial and geopolitical chaos that could have been caused by signing a deal with Rosatom to build a nuclear plant or plants in South Africa. But in this segment, I want to focus a bit more on, shall we say, the individuals and also the heroes, as Jennifer mentioned. Let's start at the beginning. Our ex-president, then President Jacob Zuma, believed that he was poisoned by foreign parties or subversive elements and fled to treatment in Russia. This is where the whole thing started.
Yes, essentially, as a consequence of Jacob Zuma's belief that he had been poisoned by the CIA, then, under the leadership of Barack Obama, that he believed that anyone who stood in the way of the nuclear deal was somehow linked to this agenda against him, which he told the State Capture Commission in 2019 had been, going on for something like 3 decades. And in Zuma's mind, every issue that he's faced, whether it's the corruption case against him, the cutting of his legal fees, his political difficulties, all of it is linked back to this so-called plot. And as a consequence, when you see Treasury officials, like, for instance, in Nhlanhla Nene, who's a very deeply religious, introverted man, coming and saying, listen, hold on, I think we need to, have a sense of how this thing is going to be financed. Let's do this properly. Karyn Maughan as well, and Lungisa Fuzile, the DG of Treasury. They then get tarred, they're not seen as people who are literally trying to do their jobs. They're seen as these agents of the West. And it's not incidental that, in July, around about the period in 2015, when Nene says he refused to sign a letter that he believed amounted to some kind of financial guarantee to the Russians, the Treasury would intervene in circumstances where we were not able to repay Russia for the nuclear build, that he then, the whole Treasury upper echelon who are standing or raising questions about the nuclear deal then gets, accused of being apartheid, driven, puppets of the West, puppets of apartheid spies. And we know, of course, that Karyn Maughan, when he was fired by the president, was fired off the back of a fake intelligence report that accused him of economic treason with the West. And I think it's very important to see how that language of, condemning people who are simply doing their job, asking the right questions, is now making its way into public, into certain political discourse, amongst others by our tourism minister, Lindiwe Sisulu, who has come out and called black judges who are simply doing their jobs, applying the law, applying the constitution, of being puppets of white people. So that language is very much, part of that particular faction's reaction to people who are asking legitimate questions that are intent on preserving rule of law and protecting the South African public from adverse procurement.
Karyn, I think what was interesting is you write that when Zuma was asked whether any of his cabinet ministers disagreed with the deal, he said absolutely not. I think I've got two questions. One, would that be true that none of them actually spoke up? And two, if none of them spoke up, what would have been the pressure on people like Nene that you mentioned, like on Pravin Gordhan, to stand up against their president, who actually had a lot of power at that stage?
You know, he also said that, oh, the only issue they were raising was the cost. You know, like that's not a big issue. But that was the issue, was how are you for this? What is the cost going to be? But I mean, if we look at the Zondo report that's just been released, you know, about the removal of the Eskom executives in March 2015, which I argue was not only linked to the state capture project, it was also linked to that ultimate attempted act of state, the nuclear deal. You know, then Chief Justice Zondo says, are you not ashamed to the ANC? Like, how do you just let this happen? And I mean, at the time that occurred, the President Cyril Ramaphosa actually came out and said to Parliament, you know, this is not a moment to panic. This is going to be the beginning of a new era for Eskom. You know, this is positive. So there was this kind of situation in which no one was openly defying President Zuma, and one may argue that they wouldn't have had the ability to do that. But also there are question marks over the way in which a number of ministers, and this is documented by Nene, turned on him when he was in Russia and said, look, I can't sign this letter. Like, I've got real and valid concerns about it. I don't want to sign it. And he then, you know, in a very understated way, says that his own colleagues, his own fellow cabinet ministers treated him with disdain and were actually quite, you know, horrendous to him in that context. So there was very much this, you know, and it's a toxic kind of mix if you regard yourself as a constitutional democracy, where, as I said before, whoever happens to be in power is the person who wields all these abilities to make these clear, determinative decisions, but the people who are trying to hold the line then get targeted, accused of being spies, accused of being agents of the West, and ultimately lose their jobs.
All of this was done, you think about the Bell Pottinger case, you think about the Guptas, under a narrative. It was done under the narrative of state capture, one might say. It was done under the narrative of as Thabo Mbeki referred to it in this week, an attempt to get to resources. This system, the heroes that were there, that you refer to the fact that there are people who made these big decisions that could have sunk us, but there are also people who make big individual decisions, although in a democracy, that saved us, like Nhlanhla Nene. Does this narrative with the Guptas and with state capture and with the search for resources still continue to this day, you think?
No, absolutely. And you see it, you know, we see it even in the language that gets employed against Eskom and particularly Andre de Ruyter, who, you know, these guys are trying to clean up a massive mess. I interviewed Nhlanhla Nene, you know, I think the week before last. And I said to him, what do you say to people? Is there any hope? And he said, look, it's far harder to clean up a mess than it is to create that mess. I think that is the real sense that we are in, is that we are in the season of reckoning for what has happened before. But when we talk about heroes, we also need to mention Liz McDade and Makoma Lakala, who were from SAFSE and Earthlack, Africa, two middle-aged women who brought this really intelligent court case that questioned, you know, the legality of the nuclear deal that was done with Russia and with other countries, and brought a legal challenge with Advocate David Unterhalter as their counsel that essentially shut the deal down in 2017 in a way that, despite the best efforts of, you know, the Gupta Allies, you know, Machela Koko, Anaj Singh, and, you know, the desperate efforts within Eskom to use Eskom as a platform for the deal, it was dead in the water. And they did that because the court, the Western Cape High Court Judges Lee Bozolek and Elizabeth Bartman, applied the law, and they applied it in a careful, considered, apolitical way. So when we talk about heroes, we cannot forget the courts of law in this country. And when we see people like Lindiwe Sisulu and others attacking the courts, Jacob Zuma's defiance, this idea that, you know, the courts are anti-transformative, that black judges are puppets, that is all part of a very campaign, and we have to call it out for what it is.
Absolutely. Karyn, it's been wonderful talking to you. I wish we had another half an hour thank you very much for blowing the whistle, for telling the story as it is in a way that every person can read. You can sometimes read these books and you think, what the hell is happening? But it's written lovely and it's written beautifully. Nuclear, Inside South Africa's Secret Deal. Thank you very much, Karyn Maughan. Wys jou nie, en mens moet die helde ook besing. Daar is positiewe dinge en daar is hoop. Mens moet altyd daaraan vashou.